running of today. The last portion of the session will be a discussion. If you're not on Whova already, go to this event page and put your questions in the Whova Q&A box or in the chat throughout the talk, so we have lots to come back to. You can upvote the questions you want to see posed to our speakers in the Q&A section, so please do that. And we do have about 25 minutes for discussion at the end, but that is never enough, so you can use the chat feature throughout. To start us off, you can introduce yourself in there now, let us know where you're joining from, and you can also privately message people through Whova if you want to talk more about something. We do also have the roundup session from 6:30 to 8 p.m. tonight, British time, where there will be some more time for discussion, so do join us for that if you haven't got your eye on another session already. If anyone has anything specific that they need for the session to be accessible to them, please let me know. You can either unmute yourself now and let all of us know, or you can put a note in the Whova chat or a private message myself or Hamid, whatever you're most comfortable with. I don't see any unmuting. So to roll on, in this session, we will hear the results of a global survey on how the COVID-19 pandemic affected policymaking and policy discourse around universal basic income, how basic income can be used as a tool for economic contraction and an approach to the first step towards a just transition. Our speakers today will be taking us through all of this. Thank you all of you for joining. Could you give us a quick 30-second introduction to yourselves? I'm going to pass off to Reinhard first.
Okay, good morning everybody and thanks for joining. I'm Reinhard Huss. I'm a retired public health academic, and I'm also a member of UBI Lab Network and BN and ATTAC, and I'm the sort of co-author with 5 other people of this presentation, and I will lead you through the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Gavin? You're on mute, Gavin.
Wasting your time. Hello, I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand in the Southern Hemisphere. I'll be talking about, well, you know my topic, but I did pre-record it, but I think the camera on Zoom is producing rather better than my own pre-recording, which is even more grey and dull and boring. But I'm looking forward to that.
Laura, pass off to you.
Thanks. I am the campaign director at World Basic Income. So we're a UK-based organisation that's campaigning for a worldwide basic income. And we're going to talk about international carbon charge and dividend, and specifically why we think carbon charges or carbon taxes should be raised and distributed internationally and via a long-term fund.
Finally, Paul.
Hi, my name's Paul Harner. I'm co-founder of World Basic Income along with Laura, and I'm an economist. I've worked with all the nasty organisations that you can think of around the world. Over 20 years ago, I was handing out basically cash in Malawi, and yeah, it's pretty simple as far as we're concerned. If you give people cash, it helps with their poverty situation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us. So each group, Reinhard, Gavin, and then Laura and Paul will speak for 15 minutes, one after the other. Again, do put your questions in the Q&A throughout so you don't forget them for the discussion. Now, for anybody who's been to Congress events before, you might have heard this, but our volunteer team created a mission statement so we could summarize what we're trying to achieve with the Congress. And I just want to share that with you now briefly. We believe that freedom from poverty and human security should be a basic human right. And we believe that basic income is the best method of transferring this right into a living reality. It's time for a basic income to happen. So we're here to talk about how to make it happen. We can only achieve this through cooperation and collaboration. And our mission with this Congress was to bring speakers and attendees from all over the world together to take basic income from an idea to a reality. So we hope you enjoy the session, and I'm going to hand off to Reinhard.
Okay, thank you, Lena. So I will now try to share the screen again, and hopefully it will work. So can you see this?
No.
No? Okay.
Did work before, folks.
Yeah, and then trying. So is it working now?
Unfortunately, not. No.
I
have a suggestion. You can kick off and send me the slides, and I can try and pull them up on my screen.
I thought I sent them already last night. Shall I send them again? But I can send. Shall I send?
I've got them. I'll pull it up.
Oh, I think now it's working somehow.
Oh, there it is. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what is what I did or didn't do. Okay. So can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay, that's great. So thank you for coming, attending the session, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to present this topic: how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected policymaking and policy discourse around UBI? Findings of a global survey. And this survey was arranged and implemented by a group of people: Liz Fuchsman, Ali Köglioglu, Julio Linares, Sheila Reguer, Annie Miller. And we also thank Malcolm Torrey, who contributed part of the survey. And myself, I'm called Reinhard Huss. So let's start. Now, the goal of our of this presentation is to present this global survey, which took part in the second half of 2020, to assess the impact of the global COVID-19 pandemic on discourse and policy related to basic income. The outline of this presentation is there's a question which I already posed in the poll: background, methods, findings, and discussion, and conclusions and recommendations. The question for you, and I think quite a few have answered. If you haven't, then please do so in the poll or in the chat. What do you think was the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on the global public debate about universal basic income? Most of you said that it has increased the sort of idea, spread the idea, and made people more aware also about the vulnerability when they suddenly lose their income. So let's now see what was the response in the survey. So the background is: in December 2019, the first case reports of COVID arrived from China, and in March, WHO, the World Health Organization, declared COVID-19 outbreak a global pandemic. And at the same time, we didn't know at the time, but we used this paper. The World Bank started a living paper about social protection measures with regular updates. And our question regarding this epidemic was: what emergency social protection policies have been introduced, and how have they been framed in relation to basic income? What types of universal basic services are in place in these places when the measures were introduced? And what organizations exist to promote universal basic income? And we received 24 responses from 16 countries. So what did we do? We identified first 217 jurisdictions or states where it was possible to introduce some protection measure where there was this sort of legal precondition. We developed a questionnaire tool and a contact list of organizations and individuals whom we wanted to ask. Among them was the BN membership and the BN affiliated organizations. And we set up a website and email for dissemination of the survey tool, and an activation of an email inquiry and helpline in case people had questions about the survey. Now, the response details was part of the survey to find out who is actually responding, then what social protection measures were introduced in the jurisdiction state of the respondent, what are the basic services available in this jurisdiction, and what are the basic income organizations in this state jurisdiction. And the survey consisted of some tick box options, but also some short answers. Now, our findings, and I will discuss them at the same time. Here are the sort of basic income organizations of respondents. Most, as you can see, 17 at the bottom were BN members, and obviously there were multiple responses of the same respondent. 14 were BN affiliated organizations. There were other basic income organizations where people were participating, and some were not involved in any, actually 5, but from their response, it was clear that they had some interest in basic income. Some was a high-ranking member in the ministry, and she was involved in cash transfers in her country. Here are the country of respondents. So we had quite a few countries where we just got one response, but there were altogether 5 countries: Malawi at the bottom, Canada, Brazil, Australia, where we had 2, and the United States, where we had 5 responses. Here in this slide, you can see the sort of social protection measures which were sort of mentioned in the responses from these countries, and the one in light blue, these were sort of general protection measures, while the orange, yellow were sort of targeted at specific groups. And on the right side, you can see we asked whether there was a media debate around the topic, and you can see in most of these countries there was a yes, a media debate. And the last column indicates whether there was a government claim that they introduced a basic income. And we only got one yes response from Colombia, where the government seemed to have claimed that it was a basic income they have introduced, while the respondents thought that this was not the case. And all these responses came in during the second half of 2020. Now here you can see that we assessed these social protection measures and how they related to the basic income criteria. And you can see that one criteria was fulfilled by all protection measures, and this is the cash transfer. Obviously, cash seems to be the easiest way to help people immediately and quickly. The others were sort of partially fulfilled. One of them, which you can see where it was hardly fulfilled, is the universality, where the most responses were no, while with the other criteria it was mixed, and in some countries they were applied and in others not. And we also added, which is not directly part of the BN basic income criteria, uniformity on the right side, and subsistence, meaning a full, complete basic income which covers all needs, which you find just next to the cash criteria. Now I have problems to go with the next slide. I don't know what is happening. Sorry. Okay, now it's going again. So other characteristics of the social
Reinhard.
protection measure, such as duration, and we
Reinhard.
inquired, and you can see the results on the left side.
I'm
Most
really
were
sorry.
temporary.
I'm very sorry to
Hello?
interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Your screen stopped sharing. You need to reshare your screen.
Oh, okay. Sorry, so this morning seems to be. Share screen. Is it sharing?
Not yet, no. There we go.
Okay. So, can you see?
Yep, we're cooking with gas now.
Can you see, Lena and everybody? Yeah. So, yeah, okay. So the duration as a characteristic, it was mostly temporary, and we asked also whether other benefits were withdrawn, and this was mostly not the case. Now, here is an interesting response. We tried to find out what were the funding sources for this social protection measure. And there was quite a high number in the green where the people were unsure, the respondents. We asked about money supply or quantitative easing, tax, loan, sovereign wealth fund. And as you can see, many were unsure how it was actually funded. And this, I think, appears quite typical that the whole state funding is like a black box for many people, and it's not clear. And also, I mean, like I live in the UK at the moment, and the funding of the furlough scheme, for instance, is not quite clear to many people and is under discussion. So now we also asked whether there is an integration of the social protection measure with other cash transfers, and it certainly was not the case in most places with state pension or child benefit, but there was some integration with other benefits in these countries. We got an interesting response from a case study from South Korea, where the respondent mentioned that Gyeonggi province paid a sort of disaster-related basic income to all nationals and some legal immigrants residing in the province in April to July 2020, and that the province introduced this measure 1 month earlier than the central government. So I think that seems to be also a feature, that there is much more initiative on the local and regional level than at the national level in terms of basic income measures. Now, in terms of media interest and public debate by country, we found that the sort of opinion was divided. However, I must say that our question was also quite long and asked actually several points. So it was also not quite clear whether respondents sort of, it was media interest about social protection measures, but also media interest about basic income. So it was not quite clear whether the response yes meant that it was actually related to basic income. Now, here are some explanations of media interest. From Canada, there was a sort of a response that a broader debate about basic income was spurred by both the emergency measures, positive elements, and their weaknesses, especially the fact that so many people who needed help were left out by its complexity and conditions. With these pre-existing weaknesses revealed, calls for a basic income have increased. In South Africa, it was Common Black Sash launched a campaign calling for basic income support, starting with those aged 18 to 59 years with no or little income and working towards universal basic income. And I think the recent riots in South Africa have revealed really the need for a basic income. And the United States UBI is picking up steam in media coverage, and Andrew Young was a great candidate, if for nothing else, than introducing UBI to many. Now, in terms of universal basic services, we got among the 24 respondents a sort of a general agreement that education and then healthcare was provided as a basic service, then housing, utilities, and an interesting response from Malawi farm inputs. And quite a few didn't give a response. And we think this is also due to the concept of universal basic services, that it is not always clear what is actually meant with it. And here, sort of from the 16 countries, we can see that in 6 countries, there was a sort of agreement that it was healthcare and education. In some, it was education. In some, it was healthcare, the same number actually. And then in 4, it was unclear. And why I think for people it is unclear, here are some examples, selected explanations. From Australia, we got a response: social housing is totally arbitrary and there is a long waiting list, and public education is only free up to secondary level and requires private funding for higher level. And Chile, education is free only up to high school, and Ireland, primary and secondary education are free, but third level education is not free. So the question is it then universal basic service if a certain level is not free anymore? So that is one of the problems with the concept of universal basic services. What does it actually include and what does it exclude? Now, we also asked questions about basic income organizations by country, and we found that in 13 countries there was a basic income single issue organization, and very few countries had a second basic income single issue organization. There was generally good collaboration. If there were these single issue two single issue organizations, then there were some where there were multiple issue basic income organizations, but there was also some lack of clarity again. The issue was, are parties, political parties, should they be counted as basic income organizations, such as the Green Party, which is in favor of basic income in many countries. And again, there was a sort of overall opinion that there was a good collaboration with these multiple issue basic income organizations. Now, some of the issues related to basic income from the respondents was that in Australia, housing is a big problem, and that according to the respondent, basic income should come in a package from housing and basic income, which highlights one of the problems of the basic income concept. If it includes food, clothing, and housing, that housing is often a specific issue. In South Africa, the response was that unemployment, poverty, and inequality requires a drastic intervention, and that the organization is working towards a universal basic income. And in South Korea, there is a basic income party with a member of parliament elected. So that is also a tendency that there are some countries who have a sort of special party on basic income, and that the governor of Gyeonggi province, which has introduced a basic income in this province, may actually be a presidential candidate in the next presidential election, which may promote the basic income in this country. Now, what are key limitations of our questionnaire? It was clearly too long, and some sections such as financing and services appear to be too complicated, which may explain the low response rate. There was no group country response available, which may have helped, because the information, as I said, which was required in some areas was quite sophisticated. And so people as a group may have felt more at ease to respond to these questions. We also ask a question about political units below state jurisdictions, because we assumed that in some countries, Canada, United States, Australia, they may have the right to introduce a basic income independent from the central government, but this question was not clearly or well understood by several respondents. And the issue, as I already mentioned, free public services, is not well defined and therefore not well understood in terms of responses. Now, in conclusion and recommendations, the COVID-19 pandemic gave a big boost to the global basic income debate, but there is a black box of government financing of social protection measures, And that highlights, I think, also one of the problems and resistance, because people are very unclear about the issue, how it will be financed and can be financed. There's a lack of clarity over the concept of universal basic services. And according to our findings, there's a good collaboration of most basic income organizations in these countries. And in terms of recommendations, future surveys should be shorter or have separate questionnaires. And it's important to improve the public understanding of basic income financing in order to gain support for basic income. And that, okay, and then we also had collected information, and I have set up a sample for Australia. There is a basic income fish sort of information sheet for the country. If this is interesting, this could be done for all the countries which have responded, and it could be, for instance, published on the BN website if there is a strong interest. Thanks a lot for listening to my presentation, and I'm waiting for your questions and later on. Thank you. I will stop sharing now.
Great, thank you, Reinhard. I'm going to pass off to Gavin. You're still on mute, so. There we go.
Thank you. My topic is quite different from that, another crisis, but interestingly, I certainly come back to COVID towards the end. And I didn't mention in my introduction that my perhaps most key part of where I come from is as an activist and candidate and worker for the Green Party of New Zealand. Of all the arguments for universal basic income, the greatest has received the least attention. That argument is climate change. The urgency of climate action leaves all the official net zero targets around the world somewhere on a continuum between precarious and hopeless. And I must add that I very recently read new analyses which are much, much more desperate than this viewpoint. While a guaranteed income could bring about a rapid reduction of consumption by widespread individual choice and with a minimum of legislation, imagine if a truly universal basic income was put in place in your country or mine. There is no guessing how many families would decide they no longer need two incomes, and no foretelling how many individuals would opt out of pointless, wasteful, or destructive jobs. But there is certainty that many would like to do so, and that a guaranteed income is the only policy that allows such action, thus enabling a dramatic drop in production and consumption. Hence, climate change is set to become the overwhelming argument for UBI, and UBI to be recognised as the only economic tool that can bring a sufficiently rapid end to destruction of climates and habitats. Climate action and guaranteed income are intimately connected. I will briefly survey the importance of evolving a more informal economy as people become liberated from overemployment. The first response to the climate crisis must be recession. If the bath overflows, turn off the tap. If the voice croaks, have some tea. This means contraction, scaling down industries. Energy alternatives are too small and too slow to meet the crisis without de-escalation, although they should be developed concurrently as a second priority. Industries that are toxic, wasteful, or useless, and those that exist only to serve them, can be abandoned at no macroeconomic cost, no loss of well-being, and huge environmental advantage. This could quickly cut emissions and commuting by a major fraction. Later, I will suggest by more than half, and liberate buildings and other resources for better uses. In contrast, gradualist government strategies now being proposed are precarious. They depend on projections that may not be accurate and marginal targets that could prove inadequate. They risk losing their narrow year-by-year margins ahead of global warming for several reasons. Responding to contingencies of storms, fires, earthquakes, pandemics, And to breakdowns, political, financial, or technical, these responses nearly always involve unplanned energy and pollution costs. While such black swan events are individually unpredictable, we do know that some combination of them is inevitable. Nobody guessed that a huge container ship would block the Suez Canal last year. At the same time, successive scientific reports from the IPCC have a consistent trend of raising the goalposts and shortening the timescale for action. Nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement are woefully inadequate, as they would lead to an estimated temperature rise of 3.3 degrees, even if fully achieved. They almost all overlook the possibility of contraction, yet switching technologies without contraction merely prolongs the problem into the future. Decoupling carbon emissions from economic growth is not much use. First, it is never complete. Commuting to the most environmentally harmless job is still commuting, and trading the most earth-friendly commodities, unless it's tightly localized, will still involve packaging, storage, transport, and marketing, all of which use energy and materials, redundant buildings, and commuting to an unnecessary degree. Secondly, decoupling is directly encouraging economic growth. It assumes you have to give people things to do via formal jobs, when in fact human activity is unstoppably creative. Sanctifying growth as an economic good sends the wrong message when we need to embrace shrinkage of consumption and ultimately of sheer numbers, what David Attenborough calls peak human, to restore biodiversity, and through biodiversity, our sustaining environment. Perhaps even more misleading than decoupling is talk about cost, the costs of climate action. The irony is that doing nothing costs nothing. Using fewer resources is not a net cost. In real terms, as opposed to financial ones, doing less costs less. To arrest climate change, contraction is more powerful than the gradualist strategies by an order of magnitude. It can leap ahead of the curve and create a safety margin of time, perhaps a whole decade, for further social and technical adaptation. At the same time, unlocking a global think tank through the increased freedom and decreased stress of people who reduce their formal employment. A think tank to find creative solutions of local or even general value. Degrowth is good news and better when planned than forced by strings of calamities. Degrowth is what I've always called the glorious recession. The challenge is to generate cultural change by talking about it now, so that recession is no longer feared as economic blasphemy or a recipe for chaos. Chaos we already have. A guaranteed income highlights the difference between jobs and work, the vital decoupling. Formal employment, the so-called job, has been taken too far and failed on two fronts. Socially, the job has proved an inefficient and unfair way of apportioning and even denying incomes. Economically, it has proved a random and now lethal way of directing development. The industrial experiment has run its course. In Bullshit Jobs, a book of 2018, the late David Graeber estimated that half of all jobs in North America were pointless. He detailed different types of self-serving and wasteful jobs, and I propose an even wider category of waste industries. The slide would be good here. Waste stands for wasteful, alienating, stressful, toxic, or exploiting. WASTE, which renders Graeber's estimate of 50% clearly conservative. We could reduce consumption by far more, but for the sake of argument, really to cut production in half with a commensurate rise in the informal economy is a sufficiently dramatic yet achievable vision. I'm aware all the time I say this that it is absolute economic blasphemy to talk degrowth, recession. Stopping the most destructive industries and slowing others reverses growth, slows the economy. Any machine or any system that cannot be slowed, stopped, or reversed is unmanageable, fundamentally flawed, and requires radical revision, hence UBI. The responses of various countries to COVID-19 showed that we have some way to go in the art of slowing down without causing unequal degrees of suffering through loss of incomes. Many industries exist just to prop up others. Creating jobs boosts the formal economy, but does nothing for well-being and nothing for the planet. Jobs exist not to do basic work for home, health, community, or environment, but to dole out spending power inefficiently, unequally, and unfairly. The paradoxical effect on the majority is to reduce their spending power and their freedom. Inventing jobs is counterproductive. It's inventing problems for people to solve instead of solving the problems we already have. It is negative. Doing work is positive. Jobs and work are not the same. Guaranteed income makes the distinction obvious and the decoupling practicable. In a more formal economy where income is guaranteed and decoupled from employment, people work to meet real needs instead of to earn money. Hence, degrowth is the key not only to minimizing climate change, but to meaningful work and fulfilling lives. In contrast to waste jobs, we can all find decent work, DECENT, dedicated, environmental, community building, enterprising, novel, transformative. In the informal economy, problems are solved, like in the household and the unpaid housekeeper. In the formal economy, problems are deliberately manufactured. Guaranteed income cuts to the heart of this issue and enables a more inclusive, rational, and feminist economics. Since planning and regulation of an orderly recession are impossible in detail, transformative economic policies are needed to act as invisible hands, guiding the contraction of industry and the localization of markets. The principal policy in this category, guaranteed income. The evidence from basic income experiments gives us no indication of macroeconomic effects of a truly universal income on an entire economy. Kate McFarland, writing for the Beyond newsletter in 2018, has catalogued limitations of such trials. Most notably, they're of limited duration and only part of a national economy. Like her, I suspect the trials were and still are motivated partly to show orthodox results, to try and win over the orthodox thinkers. For example, they show that people given an income will not prove idle, but undertake more education and more formal jobs, even long after the trial period is over. Kate comments this attitude toward basic income experiments only recapitulates society's overvaluation of paid work. Indeed, it suggests to me this dangerous falsehood that society can possibly enjoy convergence without contraction, that it can lift up the needy without bringing down the greedy. We do need contraction. When the basics of life are shared in a controlled, cooperative way, the trappings of formal economics of money and trade are relegated to their original and proper domain, dealing with surpluses and luxuries. The necessities, food, land, housing, health, freedom, and dignity. These things, the so-called free market, only manages to make scarce by exploitation. A more informal economy leads not to a specific vision, but to an ecosystem of diverse regional economies. Degrowth can settle into different attractor states of increased equality, peace, and sustainability, with all that these mean for creativity and family life, as well as the big and dirty problems on the world stage. The beauty of UBI is that combination of administrative simplicity and emergent complexity. What can be predicted is a long evolution through the liberation of human caring and creativity into new structures and a healthy combination of high, low, and timeless technologies. The COVID pandemic brought guaranteed incomes into public debate as never before, certainly from my end of the world. Much personal and business suffering could have been averted if a guaranteed income had been in place. The lockdowns also highlighted some of the advantages of reducing industry, improved air quality, return of wildlife, resurgence of human connectivity and creativity. Here briefly was evidence that slowing can be good. The direct evidence caused by illness and death is one thing, but the economic hardship of lockdowns was and still is, as we plunge into a new one this week, caused almost entirely by the inequality of status quo, by the differential economy. To all that suffering, the pandemic is just a trigger, not the prime cause. The good lessons of the lockdowns were adaptation, creativity, and environmental relief. If we don't heed those lessons, the victims of COVID-19 will have died in vain. A guaranteed income can free everyone concerned for the future to take action, partly in the form of inaction, to a degree hitherto impossible. The effect will be major, even if a sizable business as usual component still remains. Commentators around the world faced with climate change and a host of other crises are calling for radical systemic change, but nearly all, from Sir David Attenborough and Greta Thunberg down, fail to say what it should be in simple economic terms. The connection between UBI and climate action answers their call with a practical response. A guaranteed income is a necessary policy, if not a sufficient one, and the only one that is sufficiently rapid to give genuine hope. Thanks for listening. I look forward to questions.
Thanks very much, Gavin. And I'm going to pass over to Laura and Paul now.
Thank you very much. Let me just get my notes ready. Okay, so we want to talk about the potential of a carbon charge and dividend, also called a carbon tax and dividend. So carbon charges with an attack where you spend the money by giving it out to people are probably one of the most exciting policies of the last several decades. They have the potential to solve two huge human problems in one. So first of all, they can solve climate change. The best carbon taxes or carbon charges address carbon emissions at source. So rather than charging for emissions, you charge for extraction, and you, in that way, effectively stop carbon coming into the economy. The best ones are also accompanied by a cap. So you make an ultimate limit, and then you hugely disincentivize the use of carbon by making it expensive to use. So they can stop carbon entering the economy, and in that way, more or less probably stop climate change, unlike almost every other climate change policy. And then the dividends have the potential to act like a universal basic income, and in that way have all those benefits to address poverty, to reduce inequality, and so on. So this is an extremely exciting policy, and a lot of people are talking about it. We see two huge problems with the proposals. While we support them massively, there's two huge problems, which I think the universal basic income movement is closing its eyes to, despite itself. So the first problem is that the atmosphere isn't a national asset. People are polluting an atmosphere that is international, that is global, but they're keeping the financial benefits of doing so in their own countries. And the result of that is that the highest polluting countries get the biggest dividends, and the people in the lowest polluting countries, which are usually also the poorest countries of the world, get practically no dividend at all. So we have analysed some policies proposed by others and found that people in the poorest countries get an absolutely minuscule share, whereas people in the richest countries, as usual, get the biggest slice of the carbon dividend pie when you run these schemes in a national way. And so that you get people in the US, for instance, where they have very high levels of carbon pollution, will get very comfortable dividend, despite being the highest polluters in the world. So that's the opposite of climate justice. We really want to be recognizing the lesser contribution to climate change that's been made by people in less well-off countries, and really they should be getting more in recognition. It's the opposite of polluter pays. The second big problem with the usual carbon dividend proposals is that they usually propose charging a carbon tax and all of that money being paid out as a carbon dividend in the same year or subsequent year. So what that effectively does is burn through the value of our carbon resource, or our carbon, the atmosphere as a carbon sink. We burn all that value in the next few decades. And that does nothing for future generations. So future generations are still going to be saddled with an effectively ruined atmosphere or a really damaged atmosphere and a troubled climate. But none of the financial resources that we got through our management of that will be available to them. So that's a huge problem of intergenerational justice that's not addressed by the carbon dividend proposals that are usually put forward. So there is still hope. The hope lies in an international carbon charge, a people's future dividends fund, and an international dividend. So what that does is, first of all, the whole policy has to be international. There's several good reasons why this is useful. The first is that it makes it much easier to charge for extraction rather than emissions. Charging for extraction is so much more simpler. So there's, I think it's about 100 fossil fuel companies account for around 70% of global fossil fuel extraction. So you're dealing with a kind of 100 companies plus a bunch of little ones. Rather than dealing with, if you think how many people emit carbon, even if you look at only the big emitters, you're looking at, you know, every cement factory in the world, every power station in the world, every et cetera, et cetera. So you're then dealing with a huge complexity that inevitably is not going to pick up on a lot of the carbon usage. Dealing with extraction you can, and the good thing about doing it internationally means you can target extraction in a way that doesn't make sense when you're doing it nationally, for reasons I won't bother to explain now, but would happily do so if you want to email me. The second reason why doing it internationally makes sense is because, as I said, the benefits of the policy, i.e. the dividends, then get shared out fairly across the world, just as the pollution and the effects of that pollution get shared out across the world via our global atmosphere. So rather than having the richest people getting the most, which is what happens in practically every economic policy, instead you get people everywhere getting an equal dividend. And that is clearly a lot closer to climate justice than the national policies that are proposed. Then, as well as international, the money needs to be saved in a fund. So, and then it would only be the investment income that is given out as dividends. So the reason, so the way this would work is all the money generated every year gets put in a giant pot. That pot would then get invested in ethical ways. Ideally, the obvious solution would be for that pot to be a kind of green investment fund that would fund a huge investment owned by the people of the world in renewable energy and other technologies that generate wealth in a clean and green way. So then you effectively end up with a load of wind farms, solar farms, you know, wave generating initiatives that are owned by the people of the world and generating a return. And it's that return that's paid out as a dividend. So we have done some calculations about this, because when we first decided to put the money in a fund in our modelling rather than give it out straight away, I was concerned that that would mean that people would get hardly anything as a dividend. But actually, if you look across a few years, and I'm going to see if I can share my screen to show you the figures that we came up with. Let me just get onto the right bit. Where have I put it? Where have I put it? Is it here? Okay. Sorry, excuse me a moment. I'm still a beginner on this. Right. Am I sharing this screen now?
Nope.
No, let's give it another go. Choose what to share. Oh yeah, this.
There you go.
Okay.
But we
sharing.
We no longer can see your face, but that's fine if this is just.
That's okay. You don't need to see my face. Very much not the most important thing here. Let me just, sorry, I was on another tab that had the right page up. So you can see this is our paper on the topic. Okay, so here's one scenario. Can you see this table that I'm showing?
Yep.
Yeah, so here's one scenario that we modeled. So we're assuming a 6% return on investment, which might be a bit ambitious at the moment, but it gives you an idea of what might be possible. So this looks at the amount of emissions that you could generate. This is assuming that we reduce to zero carbon fossil fuel production by 2045, which was a proposal at the time. And then assuming a carbon charge that's starting at $70 per tonne and rising by 4% each year. And so then that looks at how much money you end up with in the sovereign wealth fund. So the first year it would generate $2.5 trillion. And so if you're distributing only the investment income on that, that gives you a worldwide dividend for every person in the world, adults and children, of $1.62. So that's per month. So that's obviously pretty small, not very useful. But then you go 3 years forward, so to 2023, and now you've got $10 trillion in the fund, and that's generating a monthly dividend of $6.32. So that's starting to become a relevant amount for people in the very poorest countries. Another 3 years, you're at $10 over, more than $10. Another 3, you're at $14, and then it rises to $23 by, when does it get to that? Well, by about 2038. So sort of 15, 20 years in, you're at over $20 per person. So, you know, that's not a basic income that we would think of in the West, but it's certainly something that's extremely relevant to people in most of the countries of the world. And that, in my organization, which is World Basic Income, that's very much our interest. I'm going to stop sharing and come back to you. So yeah, the benefits of putting it in a fund mean that income continues to be paid. So once you get to that sort of $20 amount, that continues to be paid in perpetuity to every single person that's ever born in the future, because that income continues to exist in the fund, continues to be invested, continues to generate new wealth by harvesting wind energy and so on. Can I turn the video back on? Yes. Have I not turned it on? I've got a box on my screen. Let me see if I can do it. There we go. Am I back? Hey. So to summarize, we really support carbon charge and dividend. It's a fantastic policy that is a perfect partner to universal basic income. It can form one funding stream for a universal basic income, and a very important one, and solve climate change at the same time. But it is absolutely vital for global justice, for climate justice, that this policy be operated internationally rather than nationally. That makes sure that you have the polluter paying the most and not the polluter receiving the most. And also that the poorest get a share rather than the poorest getting nothing. And it's vital that the money is saved in a fund so that there is some provision made for people in the future who still have a damaged climate. So I'll hand over to Paul, who I'm sure has got some further comments on that.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, this kind of approach obviously can be used with carbon. We've modelled it, but it should be used with every single type of extraction, and I'd even go further than that. It should be used with our commons, the world's commons, the use of the land, air and sea, and I would expand that to data. We co-created all the data on this planet, and the 5 richest companies in the world have got it for themselves. I'd also like to emphasize that modelling that we did and the amounts that were paid out included children. In World Basic Income, all children should be paid a basic income as well, because we see it as a human right. All of us should have a fair share of our commons. And I noticed today a report from UNICEF, 1 billion children at risk from climate impacts. 1 billion. In fact, all children in the world, 2.2 billion children in the world, are at risk from one type of climate impact, whether it be flood or drought or hurricanes or whatever. But like 1 billion are at risk from 4 impacts. That's how bad things are now. We need some kind of cap on carbon and a charge on it, and we need it quickly. And the beauty of it is that by doing that, we can also solve poverty. And I don't know how long I've got, but what I would like to emphasize as well is that this session is not only about climate change, but also COVID. We wrote a paper last year, or a media article last year, emphasizing that until everybody is safe, then none of us are safe. And that applies not only to the production and distribution of the vaccine, but also the ability to self-isolate, to do the right thing. We've seen all across the world that poor people have been forced back into work in basically unsafe conditions. If everybody had a basic income, you would at least be able to stay at home and isolate and do the right thing. So this idea of a world basic income, it's applicable to the COVID situation, it's applicable to the climate crisis, and it's also applicable to the poverty crisis that we face. Yes, it would be implicitly, all that Laura said, implicitly, there would be a redistribution of wealth from the wealthy to the rest of the world. Have I got any more time, Lena?
You can have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. So what I'd like to finish off by saying is that much of the time we're faced with messages of despair. The climate crisis, what are we going to do about it? The destruction of our environment, what are we going to do about it? And I think it's really important that there are messages of hope as well. And that's what's so fantastic about this conference. Basic income brings a message of hope in a world where so many messages are pretty negative. So I think I'll just finish by saying that central banks have got the power to issue a basic income to everybody across the world. We've seen how they've used their superpowers, and they do have superpowers. We've seen in many Western countries that they were asked to ensure full employment between 1945 and 1979, and it happened because money all of a sudden was expected to achieve a social goal. We saw that the central banks were told, oh, bail out the banks back in 2008, 2009. It happened. And now the stark reality is there, that all across the world, central banks were told to help people through the COVID crisis. In my own country here in the UK, basically, there was quantitative easing and a huge amount of money was given to business, which in turn gave it to many of its employees, but there were huge amounts of people excluded. What we're saying is that all across the world, there is the potential, in fact, to just give people a basic income. Do something sensible with your quantitative easing, okay? So, yeah, we think there's 3 routes to this. What Laura talked about was basically adjusting taxes in a very sensible way. Another way is through central banks. And the third one, and I'm sure there's some sessions at this conference, that is that a cryptocurrency emerges that is popular all across the world or in many places that embeds a basic income within its design. I think that's 2 minutes. Thanks, Lena.
Yep. Thank you very much again to Reinhard, Gavin, Paul and Laura there. That was fantastic. I'm going to quickly try and get through a lot of these questions. They have been coming in through private message and on Hoover. You can continue to put them in on the chat there. So firstly, I'm going to go with a question for Gavin, but I think that the other speakers could also chime in on, which is how to communicate strongly and fast enough to make the transnational scene act in union to undergo the serious steps towards such a life-saving transformation, or in other words, how to make the first step and set for a really massive continuous basic income pilot program under global conduction and attention. So I'm going to pass to Gavin first because that's who was identified, but then I'd welcome the other speakers to join in after.
Well, certainly not the easiest of questions. I would put my hope in governments more than transnationals, and put the corporates last possibly in. Although they're good on greenwash and good on, some are making genuine changes, but I think it's a sort of a Green New Deal idea, which is in a way furthering growth and making money out of new alternatives and things. I put my hope in countries, somehow in international cooperation. That seems to have been a big theme even just tonight. It's a big somehow. COP23 coming up in November could be very interesting. I would love a few really key people to take up this theme, because that's where there is going to be the eyes of the world. Democracy is in a way our great big hope, and people do need to be all pushing for the change.
Fantastic. Yeah. Reinhard, Laura, Paul, anything to add there?
No, I don't think I have anything to add to this question.
No worries. Paul?
Yeah, I could add to it. What we've got here in the world is a real deficit. And that is, we don't have any powerful international organization representing the people. What we have is the United Nations. And what they've said about climate change and what they've said about COVID and vaccinations and all the rest of it, and the ecological emergency has been fine. We are in an existential crisis, says Gutierrez. The problem is they have very, very, very little power. And the power resides with the rich nations of the world, the billionaires and the rich companies. And we, as Gavin says, we are coming up to COP26, and already we've seen the lobbyists for the fossil fuel companies putting article after article into our mass media, trying to play down the extent of the crisis that we're in. So I think really history shows us that the only way forward is some kind of mass mobilization. We rarely see governments doing the right thing, or should I say rich governments doing the right thing. We are basically beholden to the billionaires at the moment. Billionaires have bought our media, they've bought our universities, they've bought our politics. There's dark money all over the world, and they're not paying their taxes. So for me, mass mobilization is the only way to go in order to address this imbalance of power. It's going to be hard.
Yes.
Lena, now I have got a comment, if I may just add.
Of course, please do.
Yes, because Paul just inspired me. Because I think there is a dilemma which we need to consider. I agree with Paul that there is no sort of powerful global organization. However, to deal with the issues, I mean, the UN is an interstate organization and therefore limited by what its members want the UN to do. However, the problem is if we have a hierarchical organization, normally the power in these organizations is, whatever you call it, hijacked or occupied by an elite. So if you have a world organization which has the power, I must say I'm a bit afraid that it would not best work in the best interest of the masses or the people. So there is a dilemma in terms of how to sort of deal with these issues. Thank you. I haven't got an answer.
That's fine. I have a question on the same kind of subject. Laura, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I just wanted to be a bit more hopeful, I think, than the other speakers on this. I don't think we need to, I mean, of course, always a global movement, a global mass movement is what we ultimately need. But I think to translate that into more kind of doable terms, I think we need people in the world to demand solutions. I think that does make change. And I think the most useful thing is if we can start to demand, to coalesce our demands around something a bit more specific than perhaps we have done in the climate movement. So UBI, the UBI movement has done a great job of coming together, coming up with a shared definition of what they're actually demanding, universal, unconditional, and adequate UBI, and providing various models of how that could be done. I think we need the same in the climate movement. There's a real scattergun approach at the moment where so many different things are demanded that governments can get away with saying, you know, we'll just plant a couple of acres of trees and it will be done. I think if we come together and demand a major global intervention, such as international carbon charge and dividend, obviously I think that's the answer. We don't need a mass movement where everybody's rising up and refusing to go to work and a giant kind of global strike or, you know, anything of that kind of scale. I think public opinion does have a huge impact on our governments. Most of us are lucky to live in democracies which are sort of moderately functioning. We are driving the agenda of the world. Yeah, all right, Paul. Let's just give it up. But I think, you know, we do ultimately have more power than we think. There's no reason why, you know, the COP26 would even be taking place if it wasn't for the demands of people of the world. This is not corporations making this sort of thing happen. We're making this happen. We can make a lot more happen if we come together and articulate something in a united way. And I think we have the potential to do that. And I hope that we do that.
Thank you very much, guys. I'm conscious of moving back towards a more central UBI theme, and I wanted to ask a question, direct a question to Gavin about considering how employers would react to something like a basic income, and if they freeze wages or make work contracts more precarious, the secure shorter hours scenario, which is important for switching activity out of producing things into unpaid caring, creativity, music, art, leisure, which don't wreck the planet, that effect won't happen. So is there a need for more labour market regulation alongside these things? Is that part of the basic, the other things that the package that comes along with this? Or, and I wanted to kind of tag on to that, how would you counter the argument that basic income would promote consumerism? Because I kind of see those as two sides of maybe the same coin. Again, inviting all the speakers to comment, but Gavin first.
Yes, I don't see it as more consumerism. I don't. The evidence is that people spend, you know, when money is given to people who regard it as no hopers, and they have spent it or invested it very wisely. First thing it could be used for is to pay back debt, which reduces the amount of money in circulation anyway. That was the first part of your question. Sorry, can you just?
Yep, let me find it. Here we go. I can actually put it in the chat so you can read it.
You're in daytime, I'm in nighttime, you see.
Yes. It was about employers reacting to something like a UBI,
here it is.
And that transition period, I think.
Yeah, the effect on employers, the effect on our culture and our psychology is just, I don't think it's been looked into very much, and it's absolutely huge. There are real destructive industries and toxic ones and military ones and so on, and most of us don't care if they really crash very fast. We can see a lot of people who are in jobs related to other jobs who are going to suffer, and we can't, and it's not going to be their fault. This universal safety net for everybody at any level of distress or loss of identity, career plans and things, the universal safety net is the income, the basic income. And we have to see that as in advance in order to start to embrace the idea. The effect on the labour market, there must be some good literature about that, and I don't know it, but if a lot of people drop out of work, then labourers are going to be in demand and the whole wage situation will change. But at the same time, a lot of people will be working less, commuting less. The dream is ultimately that we are spending less and needing less. And this is a big part of the funding of UBI. The whole value of money will change, if it's any help. And there's a background too, there is a background of evidence that for thousands of years, we had tribalism, we had people who belonged to their communities. We even had a good phase just after feudalism, where people were creative, they worked shorter hours, the environment thrived, there was variety, there were local markets. Somehow we've got to use history and we've got to look forward to that.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Come on in, Paul.
Yeah, I think looking at it as how employers would react is maybe the second step. The first thing to understand is how would people react? And it's often said that a basic income is a transfer of power, basically. Money is power. So all of a sudden, people have more power. They have the power to say no to an employer. And it's a real shame that in many countries in the world that we're not getting the union movement behind basic income. They're confused. They don't understand this fundamental issue that if employees have the power to say no, then that strengthens the union movement. You can look at it another way. A basic income is like having a permanent strike fund, okay? And what we've seen is occasionally people in the unions pit universal basic services against universal basic income, but I can guarantee that virtually every advocate here at this conference would say, yes, we need both. We need universal basic services and a universal basic income. And I'll just finish now about talking about dropping out of work. The evidence from around the world is that people don't drop out of work. People want to work, but they prefer not to have bullshit jobs. They prefer to have jobs that are more interesting. And that work might be voluntary. It's interesting in Canada, many of the people who received the benefit under COVID, CERB it was called, or still is, yeah, a lot of them didn't go back to work. And there was a fundamental reason for that, is that their wages were so low. They couldn't be bothered. They'd rather carry on receiving the benefit than going back to a really ill-paid job.
Yep, they didn't go back to jobs, but they did go to work.
Ah, thank you, Gavin. Thank you. You're absolutely right. Yeah, they weren't sitting around playing Super Mario, let's put it like that. Just on the issue of consumerism, the whole degrowth debate, I think I prefer to call it post-growth. But anyway, the whole degrowth debate, etc., etc. Obviously, some things will grow and many things won't. And I think Laura spelt it out really well. You know, if we have this international carbon charge, the things that won't grow are associated with the carbon-fueled economy. Yeah? That doesn't mean to say that people will start growing more of their own food and that kind of sector would grow, or caring would grow, health might grow, whatever. Okay, so yeah, our scenario does look at a decrease in, it's implicit in there, a decrease in consumerism. And let's not forget, a lot of our clothes come from the fossil fuel industries as well, embedded. All the imports, but it just goes on and on. So yeah, a decrease in consumerism is implicit in our model. I'm sure Laura wants to say a bit more.
Can I also come in?
Oh yeah, we've got a few more minutes. You can both come in.
Laura, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. Sure. So I don't think that universal basic income in any way implies an increase in consumerism. I think, on the contrary, it's about a redistribution of income. So, you know, it's about applying taxes and charges and fees on effectively the top of the economy, the wealthy. You know, if you look at the funding model that we're talking about for worldwide basic income, all of the charges would hit the biggest spenders of the world, the biggest users of the global commons, by far the hardest, and would barely touch the people who consume less. So it's scraping it off the top and then pumping it back in the bottom. So it's not an increase in total consumption, it's a redistribution of consumption from top to the grassroots. So there's no reason to think that it's going to increase consumerism. Also, multiple studies have found that when you give money to people on lower incomes, they spend it on extremely sensible things that they definitely need. And we're never going to get anywhere as an environmental movement, much less as a UBI movement, if we talk about people, you know, buying more food, paying more school fees, paying more bus fares, as consumerism. That's not consumerism, that's people covering their essential human needs. And if that causes an increase in consumption on a graph that measures that sort of thing, we cannot see that as something problematic. I like Kate Raworth, the economist Kate Raworth's way of looking at it, which is, as she calls it, donut economics. So that basically the inside of the donut is a social floor that we're not succeeding unless we raise everyone to a certain level that they cannot fall below. But we're also not succeeding in economics if we exceed our ecological ceiling. And so we need to exist in that donut. And essentially, when it comes to growth or degrowth, I don't really care what happens to a graph in a government office. What I care about is that we keep things above the social floor and below the ecological ceiling. And I think that's what we need to focus on, policies that do that. And whether the graph goes up or down as a result of that is kind of an irrelevance. What matters is that we're making sure we're meeting everybody's needs and not burning through our planet. So I think, consumption, not consumption, it's about meeting those needs.
Yep.
Okay, just two quick points. I think I'm a bit skeptical of a partial basic income, because I think there is a risk that it serves as a subsidization for low wages. So that's why I'm always in favor of a basic income which is appropriate to cover all basic needs, including, combined with basic services. Otherwise, I think there's a risk. And second, I think what a basic income cannot address but needs to be combined with is that we need to address extractivism and the use of the commons as a sort of dumping ground for pollutants. So I think there is a lot of subsidization which is not officially called subsidies going on, and these need to be taxed adequately. I'm a bike driver and I get annoyed about all these cars blowing their dirt into my face, creating all this noise, and they do it free. They can enjoy it. There are even noisy bikes, motorbikes and cars created in order to make lots of noise when they drive around town, and nobody has to pay for it besides the person who has to be exposed to it. So, and I think the sort of new green economy with e-cars, there is a danger that we repeat the same sort of error again in terms of extracting lithium and other minerals, basically assuming for free, and then again create lots and produce lots of cars in individual transport. And I think this needs to be costed appropriately and then fed back to, maybe through a basic income to everybody who is using the commons, either through extraction or through pollutant, so that everybody, if we accept this extraction or pollution, that everybody at least benefits through adequate payment. So I also think, for instance, carbon charges should be at least $200 per ton in order to cover the costs of carbon completely. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Gavin, Paul, Laura and Reinhard. We are officially at time. I can keep the room open for 5 more minutes for anybody else, and part 2 of this discussion will be starting in 24 minutes, and we'll be having talks on globalization, inequality and the pandemic, more on pandemic and sustainable development then as well. So please do join us for that if you're interested. And as I said at the beginning, if you want to continue this discussion, the community pages are open on Whova. You can message our speakers, you can message other attendees. We do have a roundup tonight at 6:30 British time if you want to continue this conversation more then as well. So I'm just going to ask that everybody join me in saying thank you so much again to our 4 speakers. And I hope everybody enjoyed themselves, and I'll see you all in 20 minutes.
We have a thank you for Lena as well.
Yeah, thank you, Lena, for moderating the discussion and presentation. Thanks a lot. And
No
thanks
problem.
for
Lovely to meet some real people over there.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, everyone. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, there's Julio. Lovely to see you, Julio.
Yeah, good to see you too. Good job, Reinhard. That was amazing.
Yeah.
Hello.
And thanks to Hamid as well, our moderator, who
Oh,
did
yeah.
all the tech behind the scenes.
Thank you so much, guys. It's very interesting speeches, and I learned a lot by listening to all of you, and it's been a pleasure to meet you all. And Lena, it's been nice to work with you also. I'm going to log out now, and I shall see you at 10:45, whoever's at that session.
Yeah.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks loads, everyone.
Thanks, guys. I'm going to end the meeting because I need to moderate the other one. Bye.
Bye-bye, and thank you.